All right, well, good evening, everyone who's joining us today for another Beneath the Surface lecture. We have Dr. Larkin with us today from Florida. She's being kind to join us in her evening to tell us a little bit more about another marine mammal that we probably don't think about too much here on the West Coast. Today we're going to learn a little bit more about the Florida manatee. And let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Larkin. She got her PhD in 2000 from the University of Florida, the College of Veterinary Medicine. Her research focused on Florida manatee reproductive hormone concentrators related to seasonality and estrus cycle patterns. And she became faculty with the Aquatic Animal Health Program at the University of Florida, and continued her research and served as an education coordinator. So currently she's a lecturer and director of the Aquatic Animal Health Program, which trains veterinary and graduate students, residents, and interns in aquatic animal health and care. So I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about our vegetarian friends in Florida, marine mammals, and
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate being invited to come talk about manatees, and I'll do my best to stay on time because I can probably talk about manatees for forever, but we'll try to keep it within 45, 50 minutes. All right, and you guys can see my presentation all right?
I can see you.
Excellent. All right, so let me just make an adjustment here. All right. Okay, so I'll be talking about manatees and their conservation. And this is just sort of an overview, so you have an idea of where we're gonna go and what we're gonna talk about. So I'll provide an overview of some natural history on manatees and sirenians. Discuss a little bit about their range and population size, talk a little bit about their physiology, and how we monitor them, some of the natural and man-made problems that they have, some aspects of mortality, and then a little bit about management. And if you guys have heard or not, they're currently under a UME, unusual mortality event on the East Coast. And if you want, at the end, I can talk a little bit about that too. All right, so this is the group of Sirenia that we're going to be covering, although I will be focusing primarily just on the West Indian manatee. The size is sort of correct. West Indian manatees, at least the Florida manatee, are a little bit bigger than some of the other species. But in areas where the Antillean manatee ranges in Central and Southern South America, they're not quite as big. The dugong lives in areas along the coast of Australia, as well as from Australia. Well, I have a map and I'll show you that. But one of the interesting things about dugongs is that they live primarily in saltwater. And the same could be said for the stellar sea cow, which unfortunately now is extinct and has been so for quite a long time. And so you'll notice that they both have tails that are fluked, as opposed to the manatees that have the rounded tails. And those paddle-shaped tails are really very good in complex shallow waters, whereas the fluke-shaped tails are better for speed in open water. The West Indian manatee and the West African manatee both live in similar habitats in that they can swim in fresh and saltwater habitats. The Amazonian manatee is only found in the fresh waters of the Amazon, and so only in fresh water. And as we go along, if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt me. And so these first couple of slides is usually where I have a bit of a conversation with students face to face, but since we are online and limited on time, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the animals that are most closely related to manatees. Most people can usually guess that the elephant is closely related to manatees, but it's usually the hyrax that throws people off. They kind of look like very angry little rabbits with short ears. In fact, they even have tusks. But way back when, the German anatomists did a pretty good job of joining this clade together with Sirenia, Proboscidea, and Hyracoidea. And so the molecular data has borne that out. So a very interesting radiation out of Africa. So today, the Sirenians that we have, this is the range. In green are the West Indian manatees, and in red, the Amazonian manatees. Orange is the West African manatee. And then in blue is where we find the dugongs. And in most of these areas, they're rather rare. There is a pretty good population here by the Middle East. And most of what we know are from the populations along the coast of Australia. So within the US, the Florida manatee range is depicted here. During the winter months, the dotted line is essentially where they stay. And then the solid and dashed lines represent where they traverse during the warmer times of the year. More and more, they are regularly traveling along this northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, to the point where annual health assessments are conducted along the shores here, like of Alabama. So how do we know where they go? We monitor them, we put tags on them. Actually, the tag in the top here is an old school one now, because that's a VHF tag, whereas now it would be a GPS. So you can open up your laptop or look on your phone and be able to see where the signal is coming from the satellites. But the belts are designed to be able to break loose if they are stuck or attached to something, so that the animal doesn't become trapped. So there are weak links designed in there. And then there's also another signal within the belt itself in the event that the tag comes off, but the belt stays on. So that way we can track the animals, and we've been able to track them for up to a couple years. In some cases, we might have to replace the belts, but a lot of this work was done through my colleagues over at the U.S. Geological Survey Sirenia project. So they've been tracking manatees for a long time. So another way that we know a lot about their population size is through aerial surveys. And so there are a variety of different methods that are used to count manatees. In essence, there are specific times during the winter months where a number of airplanes and boats will all go out with specific transects that they'll count manatees from. But of course, it ends up being a bit of a challenge, because you're not going to be able to necessarily see all of the animals. And they do move. And so despite the fact that we have specific transects, there's the possibility of counting more than one. But for the most part, the aerial surveys are considered a minimum number. And even just looking in this particular picture, it can be a bit of a challenge. For sure, I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's possible there might be another one here. Perhaps there's a calf here under this animal. But certainly, if there were animals under the vegetation, we would never be able to see them, right? So ultimately, these end up being minimum counts when we do the population assessments. So this has been the trend. So when I first started studying manatees, the numbers were around 1,500. And now the minimum counts have been hovering around 6,000. And the estimates have been as high as 8,000. So with the increase in the population numbers, there was a recent change to their status from endangered to threatened. And I can talk a little bit about this later, but not only did they change the status for the Florida manatee, they did it for the West Indian manatee. So that would include populations in Central and South America as well. But within Florida, there are essentially four management areas. So the blue, the red, the green for the Atlantic, and the yellow for the St. Johns River area. And these are mostly management delineations. The largest population of manatees is going to be along the East Coast, and second to that is the Southwest coast. The two populations along the Panhandle and the St. Johns River system, while smaller, are the ones that are essentially growing more. And part of that is the fact that they're areas that are slightly less populated by people. And so more room for the manatees to grow. So a little bit about their physiology. Manatees are unique. They have a number of different characteristics that define them as unique. They have a very low metabolic rate. So despite the fact that they look very large and round and seem to have a very thick hide, they have to behaviorally thermoregulate, which is why during the winter months, you'll see them hovering around warm water sites, and those can be natural sites or they can be artificial sites. So warm water that might be emitted by a power plant, for example. And they have a very distinct threshold for cold water. So once the waters become about 68 degrees or colder, they for sure are looking for warm water. And it ends up becoming a real concern for them because they can suffer from what's called cold stress. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. So they are a large herbivore. This in and of itself puts them in a very unique niche. There are no other marine mammals that are herbivorous. The only other animal within their habitat that has a similar niche is the green sea turtle. And so, of course, being a reptile, their physiology is quite a bit different. They are a hindgut fermenter. And when you compare them to domestic species, they're probably most closely similar to a horse. But their GI tract is very large. It takes up almost a quarter of their body weight. And so the extent of the small and large intestines are really very extensive. And what ends up happening is this very extensive digestive tract takes a very long time for food that's eaten to come out the other end. So, for example, an elephant, which is also a very large herbivore, is very similar to a lot of herbivores in that its transit for food is anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. But for manatees, anywhere from 7 to 10 days. And so there are a lot of folds that essentially slow down the transit of the food. And the seagrasses that they eat really are fairly low in nutrition and very high in fiber. And so by slowing everything down, it really increases and enhances their ability to absorb as much material and nutrients from these seagrasses as possible. Another really unique feature that they have is they have what's called marching molars. And so this is an image of their jaw. So what would be right here. So they have new, well, essentially their only teeth are molars. So they don't have any other types of teeth. Instead, they have these pads in the front. And the teeth erupt from the backs. And as they chew, the movement and mastication actually cause the teeth to slowly move forward. And then the old teeth fall out the front. And that happens throughout their entire life, which is really very interesting. It has allowed them to essentially outcompete the dugongs in the Western Hemisphere. Because if you find a fossilized Sirenia bone here, it's probably a dugong. But manatees were essentially able to eat them out of house and home. All right, so the foods that manatees eat, for the most part, the submergent vegetation in fresh and saltwater areas are their primary foods. Thalassia and Ceragodium are great examples of what they enjoy eating. But if the water level is high enough, they will eat the leaves off the trees and the grass off people's yards. There's all kinds of great pictures where hurricane storm surge have, flooded areas, and manatees end up in places that they really shouldn't be, especially golf courses and things like that. So their stomachs tend to lead them into all kinds of trouble. So some other unique things about manatees. The professor that I did my PhD with, Dr. Roger Reep, was a comparative neuroanatomist. I'll always remember one of the first days that he showed me his lab. He had this whole wall full of jars of brains. And manatees have a very unusual brain. It's a very smooth brain. As opposed to our brain, or in this case, there's a cetacean brain up here that has all kinds of folds, so sulci and gyri. So when I first met Dr. Reep, one of the things that he was doing was mapping out the manatee brain and trying to figure out, why was their brain so differently? And essentially, it's just arranged differently. They have a very similar ratio of white and gray matter in their brains. It's just evolved differently. So something very unique. There have been a number of studies looking at manatee hearing and vocalizations. Manatees do make unique sounds, but there's not a lot of communication going on. It's mostly, as far as we can tell, reactionary sounds. They can be unique sounds in that you can identify specific individuals from the sounds being made. They are not related to echolocation, so they're passive listeners. Probably their weakest sense is their vision. Their eyes are very small. They have sort of these pinhole eyelids, and they would be considered legally blind. They do have rods and cones, so they can see color. But in most of their environments, they're in waters where you really can't see very much, right? It's not very clear. They don't live in the springs. And so vision is not really something that they invest a lot of time and energy in. By contrast, their what I would call super sense is their touch. And while they don't look like they have a lot of hair, they are very strategic in their hair. They have these very fine little hairs across. So this is an image across a manatee's back. And each of these hairs is long enough and flexible enough that it can turn in 365 degrees and not run into its neighbor. But it's a very sensitive hair. This is also a manatee's muzzle, so the front. The nares are up here along the top, and the mouth is down here. They actually have these very prehensile lips where they can avert very specific vibrissae that are thick, almost like little fingers that they can use to grasp the food. And so much like an elephant's trunk is prehensile, a manatee's lips are prehensile. In fact, they can grab food on one end and be pushing something they don't like out the other end. So they can move these things independently. So you can also see that there are hairs along the muzzle, again, very sensitive for touch. And what one of the things that Dr. Breep studied in regards to these hairs was the fact that these are sinus hairs. And so in particular, here you can see an example. The yellow is the follicle with the hair embedded in there. And then you see this space here just around the follicle. And there's a lot of innervation. And essentially, this is like a little blood sinus. And so every tiny little movement of that hair will push it one way or another, and the nerves will pick up that kind of movement. And so the manatee has these hairs across its entire body. And so just like a fish has a lateral line where it can sense the movement of water, manatees have that across their entire body. And so they're this amazing array of information about water flow. And so just like animals, terrestrial animals can detect scents that might be upwind from them, manatees can feel the currents that are disturbed from animals swimming in the water. So you may not know when you're swimming in the water where the manatee is, but the manatee knows exactly where you are. So very interesting and sensitive sense of touch. And then finally, their sense of taste and smell. There's been a little bit of work actually by one of my PhD students looking at taste and smell in manatees, and they do have this sense. And in fact, we were able to show that manatees can use their sense of taste in the water to detect females in estrus, which is really very interesting. You know, so they are able to do some chemical detection in regards to the status of other animals, but it would be nice, of course, to do a little bit more than what we've done so far. All right, reproduction. So I spent a significant amount of my time looking at manatee reproduction. Manatees are interesting in that they form what's called a mating herd, which is pictured here, where you essentially have a single female being pursued by multiple males. And these mating herds can last several weeks, which is kind of unusual because as far as we know, for most animals, estrus really is a fairly short period of time. But I have my hypotheses as far as why that lasts so long. And I think that has something to do with their very slow digestive tract. But in any case, they do have some seasonality in Florida during the winter months when it's pretty cold and they are physiologically stressed because of the cold weather and decreased food availability. There's not much reproduction going on. But when the warmer weather comes during the spring, that's essentially when we have a lot of that reproductive activity start up again, and many of the calves are born, but they will form mating herds throughout most of the warm months. Usually that slows down during the fall season, and then they'll stop again during the winter months. There are obviously warmer winters than others, but for the most part, you don't see these mating herds during the winter. As far as we know, manatees are pregnant for about a year, and the young will nurse from 1 to 2 years. Of course, there's variability in that timeline. Birthing intervals then are about 3 years. And again, that can vary by individuals. In some cases, if females aren't healthy enough, or for one reason or another are stressed, that interval can be longer. For the most part, they only have one calf. And occasionally they'll have twins, but that's rare. So we do health assessments on the wild population in a few key areas in the state. Crystal River, which is on the west coast, about an hour and a half north of Tampa, is a spring-fed river system, and it's an amazing place to go see manatees, and it's a very healthy area that within that area we do our health assessments to sort of establish the continued healthy baseline for manatees, and we'll measure anything and everything under the sun that we can do within 1 hour once we have our hands on the animal. So we'll do visual tests, we'll take blood samples, we'll take morphometrics, genetic samples. So we'll take a small, what they call a cookie from the edge of their paddle. So morphometrics, measure length and girth, and we can assess a lot in regards to the health status of the animal through morphometrics. And blood samples are taken from the flipper. So a wide variety of things that are collected: fecal samples, urine samples, microbiology samples, things like that. Okay, so some of the man-made problems, anthropogenic problems. This is another slide where I'm usually asking people what they think are some of the top things. Most folks get that the boats are a significant issue, and it's the number one cause of mortality that's human related. There are enough manatee boat interactions that approximately 80% of the population of manatees have scars where the animal or individual can be identified. And so we have a whole photo ID program based on recognizing manatees from their scar patterns. We've learned quite a bit in regards to what manatees can or can't survive with in regards to their injuries. And I think for the most part, the boating zones, the slow speed zones that have been created, a lot of the regulations in regards to coastal development, marine development have been, for the most part, pretty successful, considering we went from 1,500 to 6,000 to 8,000 animals in our population. So many of the management strategies, I think, have been pretty successful, although there's always room for improvement. Much like driving on the highway, many people will behave when there's marine patrol on the water, but when they're not there, people will drive the way they want to drive. So another issue is pollution, whether that's chemical pollution or things in the water that the animals can get entangled in or ingest. In this case, we have probably a crab pot line that this animal has gotten entangled with. And then another really big problem is maintaining the seagrass beds. And so what is going on here is this boat is in relatively shallow water and it's chopped up all the seagrasses. So you're seeing the sand along the bottom. And with this image, I just wanted to sort of convey how all these scars can add up. And essentially, you end up with more of a sandy bottom than a seagrass area because of all the boating activity going on in areas that are essentially too shallow. And of course, seagrasses, it's not like your terrestrial lawn. Someone does wheelies in your yard and that grass can grow back still pretty quickly. The seagrass beds really take, in some cases, it can be years before they really grow back in the same density. So taking care of the seagrasses is really very important, obviously, since that's a major food source for them. So some of the trauma that can occur in regards to boating impacts, many times most people are considering penetrating trauma. So areas where they've been hit by propellers or the skeg of a boat. But in fact, blunt force trauma, where the animals have been hit by the front of the boat, can cause a lot more damage and be more serious of an injury, where bones are broken and internal hemorrhage can occur. Some of the natural made problems that manatees have to endure, much like all of us, having diseases. In this particular case, cold stress is something that is similar to frostbite for us. So you have decreased circulation in your extremities, and over time, without the proper blood flow, the tissue starts to die. And so manatees can get sloughing of skin along their extremities. And so that's what you see here on this particular animal, especially on the flippers and along the edge of their paddle and along their nose. And so what you see here, all these little dots here are manatees that are huddling in this warm water site, which is an artificial site from a power plant. Diseases such as those caused by viruses are something very, not very well known in manatees. This particular example is one from a papillomavirus, which was discovered in manatees in the late 1990s. Much like human papillomavirus, it is spread by contact across manatees. As far as we know, it doesn't necessarily cause cancer like human papillomavirus does, but we also haven't been able to really study it for very long at this point. But they do have many other diseases, herpes virus, and there have been a couple examples of reproductive cancer in manatees. Red tide is certainly something that impacts manatees. It impacts essentially all animals in an infected area. Red tides are caused by Carenia brevis, which is a very tiny little organism, which is blown up here in this image. It produces a toxin. So when the little critter is dies, it releases the toxin in the water, and it can volatilize. So at the surface of the water is really where it's the strongest concentration. Of course, that's also where manatees and dolphins come to the surface to breathe. And so it can be a real serious problem for them. There are acute and chronic exposures to red tide because the Carenia can also settle down into the vegetation where manatees may be ingesting it. Harmful algal blooms are definitely a problem for manatees. And then perinatal and neonatal mortality for manatees is also sort of a chronic issue. It impacts about 10% of the population, and often includes things like dystocia or abandonment from mothers with not a lot of experience. So just a little bit more detail about cold stress. I talked about the fact that it's kind of like frostbite. It's particularly troublesome in manatees because they do have a low metabolic rate, and it impacts juvenile animals more severely than the adults, and primarily because they have a smaller body mass to weight, surface area ratio. So they aren't able to maintain their body temperature as well as adults, but also because they're juveniles and they don't necessarily have the same level of experience and end up in the wrong place at the wrong time because they're not necessarily paying attention to the drop in ambient temperature and things like that. And it can lead to a number of secondary infections that can impact them depending upon how severe it is. So there's a lot of management attention paid to the warm water sites that manatees rely on. So the two maps here are essentially designed to highlight to you the differences between natural and artificial sites. So the blue stars are the natural sites, and the red are artificial sites. So essentially power plants for the most part that are allowed to, or essentially have been grandfathered to allow for thermal outputs. And so the power plants save a lot of money by not having to chill the water before it's released. Of course, the manatees take advantage of that. So an unlikely alliance has essentially formed between the manatees and the power companies. But it is essentially a thermal pollutant. And there was a lot of concern in Florida after we saw how California deregulated their electricity. And there was a lot of concern of what would happen to the manatees when it became cheaper to purchase power rather than generate it during the winter months. And so there's been a lot more attention paid to natural sites. So if you look at this map of Florida on the right-hand side, you'll notice they took away the artificial sites in the event that all the older power plants that were grandfathered in were obviously not allowed to continue that, or they weren't able to renew to the point of being able to function with that particular power plant. You'll see that there's really then along the East Coast no natural warm water sites for the manatees to be able to rely on. Most of the warm water sites are within the St. Johns River system, or they have to migrate down to South Florida. And there are a few more stars here because there are a couple areas that are natural warm water sites that could potentially be made more accessible so that manatee could get in there. So maybe dredging an area that is too shallow or removing dams to allow manatees access. So with focusing on this a little bit more, there have been some really interesting papers on additional sites that manatees can rely on sort of temporarily. And in this case, the red boxes show thermal basins. So areas where the geography is such that either the water becomes warmer from the sun, so it's rather shallow and it warms up faster than some of the surrounding areas, or it has a certain configuration where it forms thermal layers. And so the manatees can maybe hang out along the bottom where a thermocline has been generated, and it might be a little warmer along the bottom, maybe because there's biomass down there that's degrading and that creates some heat. So we've learned over time now that there's a number of thermal basins that manatees can rely on. But again, that's something that is not going to be helpful for a really long cold snap. So a little bit more detail about red tide and Carenia brevis. The neurotoxin that it creates. I mean, it's not just manatees that are impacted, it's essentially all animals in the area that's impacted. And with the image along the bottom where it shows red tide that's coming close to shore, I mean, with it this far inland, everybody here along the coast would have been warned and probably asked to leave, especially anybody with any respiratory issues. In 2018, we had a particularly severe red tide, and numerous beaches were closed for an extended period of time just because the toxin in the air, it makes it very difficult to breathe and causes a lot of hemorrhage. So in the case of manatees, there's a lot of hemorrhage that can happen. Again, I mentioned earlier that it can settle down into the seagrasses. And so it's not only where they can breathe it, but potentially eat it. So this is just some of the numbers of mortality in regards to red tide over the years. You can see a couple areas where there's been significant mortality from red tide for manatees. So mortality in general, this is something that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission keeps a very close track of. And so there's actually a lot of information on this slide. The pie graph essentially provides a summary of the percentages of mortality. Watercraft, so the #1 human-related cause of mortality. Floodgates used to be a much more significant impact, but having certain protocols in place really minimizes this. And so essentially this number represents when those protocols have not been followed. Other human impacts, perinatal mortality, as well as cold stress, other causes of natural mortality, so disease-related animals that were not recovered. This number is actually, this percentage is actually increasing because the efforts of the state in regards to trying to be a little bit more judicious in the number of necropsies that they perform. And so carcasses that are too decomposed are not necropsied. And then undetermined, in the Florida heat, a lot of the carcasses end up becoming so decomposed that there's really no telling. And during the summer months, it really doesn't take very long for that to happen. But the graphs here provide a little bit more detail in regards to the total numbers and what those total numbers, what categories contribute to those numbers. And so here in 2021, you can see that the blue numbers here along the top for verified but not recovered. These are the animals that are essentially contributing to the unusual mortality event, or from the unusual mortality event, which is happening around the Indian River Lagoon area on the East Coast. And essentially that particular area, which is around Cocoa Beach in Nassau, the lagoon is behind some barrier islands and essentially doesn't flush very well with the tides that change. And so a lot of the nutrients related to runoff and development in the area have accumulated in the lagoon. So it's caused a lot of harmful algal blooms to move through the area, which have subsequently decimated the seagrasses. And over the years now, it's gotten to a point where the seagrasses can't come back. But the Indian River Lagoon is an important warm water site for manatees, and so they keep coming back. And now the problem is they are coming back to stay warm, but there's no food to support them. And so it's essentially become a tipping point for this particular ecosystem, and hopefully one where the state will pay a little bit more attention and help to fix the ecosystem, because the water quality issues are essentially what are causing this particular problem. So hopefully there'll be more attention paid to the runoff and how to address some of the problems. Okay, so in regards to managing manatees, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission work in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because longtime tradition, they're not under NOAA, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, much like a few other oddball species like polar bears and walruses, because they weren't considered historically I can't think of the word at the moment. But it's sort of a historical reason why manatees under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But most of the management essentially has focused on rescue, rehab, recovery, and release. And it's really been rather successful to date. There are a number of partners that have come together in the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership. And so manatees that are in a managed setting have all been rescued for one reason or another. Even the manatees that are in aquaria outside of the state of Florida, so SeaWorld San Diego, Cincinnati Zoo, Columbus Zoo, all of these animals are part of this rescue, rehabilitation, and release program. There's a very small number of animals that are considered non-releasable, usually they have injuries so severe that there really is not a way for them to be successfully reintroduced back into the wild. And so they end up serving as an ambassador then. All right, so we've talked about natural history. We've talked about the range of the population and some of the unique physiology characteristics that manatees have. We talked about monitoring them and man-made and natural problems and mortality and how we manage them. So that's all I've got. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Larkin. Really some fascinating information that you shared. So I really appreciate that. We had some questions that came in, and as we are going through these questions, if anybody has additional questions you'd like to ask, you could throw them in the chat. The first one was in regards to the boat strike. You had talked about their really incredible sensory organs. What is it that contributes to boat strike? Are they unable to get out of the way? Are the boats moving too fast? Do we know why they're so prone to being hit by boats?
Right, so it's a very complex topic and one that has been debated about for a long time now. So there have been some studies in regards to their hearing and the extent to which they can identify the noise from a boat. I think part of the issue is, one, sound travels very quickly underwater. And I think it can be a challenge for manatees to determine when a noise warrants action for them to move out of the way. I've seen them in river systems where, in that case, you're either going upstream or you're going downstream. I mean, it's not too complex, and they can hear it coming and they can, dive down to the bottom and get out of the way. It gets a bit more challenging when you're talking about a bay area where a wide variety of areas where boats may go and not necessarily stay in a channel. And so at one point, do the manatees decide, okay, I can hear this boat, but now it's close enough that I need to actually get out of the way. And I think that's part of the problem. One of my colleagues, Dr. Bondi, always had this great analogy. It's like if you lived on the edge of a major highway and cars are traveling at 70 miles an hour, but you have to step into that lane to take a breath. And you might be really good at it, and for years, not get hit by a car. But it really only takes one time for you to not be paying attention, and then you'll get hit. And so part of that is, I think, what's going on. There are just so many boats on the water and so many potential opportunities. And it's why 80% of the population has scars of one kind or another. And, there are a number of other animals that also get hit by boats. It's just not necessarily as well advertised. I mean, sea turtles get hit, dolphins get hit. But it seems to be a particular issue for manatees.
So we have another question about their birthing intervals, that there's a minimum of 3 years. Do they regulate when they go into estrus in order to delay a pregnancy, or how are they maintaining that 3-year interval?
Right. So during the first year or two, while they are nursing, they don't appear to be going into estrus. but they will start cycling and towards the end of that period. And when they go into estrus, the female tends to travel a lot because they'll start attracting males to them. And it's usually when the female is in the midst of that mating herd that the calf kind of gets, left behind essentially. So sometimes that estrus may start later. Some of it depends on the health of the female because there's a lot of energy expended in nursing the calf. In my personal experience, I've seen moms be less tolerant of their male calves and more willing to leave them behind than a female calf, probably because Junior's making advances on mom and she doesn't appreciate that. But there are definitely times where females may not be physiologically ready to go back into estrus, or they don't express, the signals for males to detect that they're in estrus very well. They really don't have very overt behaviors or signaling all the time to indicate to males that they're in estrus. I'm sure there are times where they may be going through estrus and males may not be able to detect it. The mating herds are really the most obvious way for us to know that a female has gone into estrus and the males have picked it up. But there are also more subtle behaviors where a mom and a calf may be trailed by younger males that probably wouldn't be able to compete with big, bold males. And I suspect that those sneaky, persistent younger males may have opportunities that are less obvious to more adult males.
Cool. Interesting. Question: do manatees have predators?
I love this question. Every time I give presentations on manatees, I always get asked this. And of course, a lot of the kids think sharks and alligators, which, you would think that they would be. But in all the years that I've been studying manatees, I think there's been one documentation of manatees down, I think it was in Puerto Rico, where there were, a manatee that had a shark bite. And there have been plenty of tags, manatee tags that have gotten bitten by alligators. So they get close. But I think that sense of touch that they have really does them justice in regards to being able to detect something that's swimming at them and to feel that wake. But then they also have a pretty large size. And I suspect that deters a lot of predators as well. Manatee cows are pretty good at staying in between any potential threat and their calf. So, I mean, if anything, I would have figured, we'd see things like that with the calves, but they do a pretty good job of navigating that. So no, humans are really the biggest impacts of mortality for manatees. They don't really have much in the way of other predators.
I've only ever really seen manatees in their rehabilitation pools, and they seem pretty slow. Are they able to move a little bit more evasively to get away from something like a shark?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That paddle, that tail that they have, incredibly strong. When they get startled, they can really move. And in fact, when we do health assessments, the most dangerous is when a manatee is on its back, because it can actually bend enough to touch its tail to its nose. And so when you're talking about a 1,000, 2,000 pound animal and having that big paddle just, flip, there's, let's see if I can go back. So this picture here, this is a manatee. This is his tail. And it has totally just gotten every one of these people totally soaked. And if I remember correctly, one of these guys that was really close ended up getting a concussion from this animal. I mean, I've seen them, break legs just by, swishing that tail back and forth when people are trying to restrain them. So they're really powerful with that tail. That's the most dangerous part of the manatee.
So maybe it's their mass that is their protection and their ability to wield that mass.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, we have a question regarding perinatal fatalities. Is this more of a natural process, or are there various human stressors playing a larger role, causing mothers to abandon calves not to thrive, etc.?
Most of what I know is natural related. So dystocias where a cow may have a calf that's gotten too large, or in some cases where there are twins and the cow isn't able to bring them both to term. So most of that is natural, but I would suspect now with this unusual mortality event going on along the East Coast that we're going to have a big decrease in the number of calves that are born and the number that are able to be brought to term, because the cows just aren't getting enough nutrients to sustain a pregnancy, or in the next year or two go into estrus. So I would suspect that reproduction is going to be the least of their concerns, and their physiology is going to shut that down because they're going to be focused on just trying to find food.
Well, we have someone who's wanting to help out. We have Connor who's asking, he's interested in becoming an aquatic animal veterinarian. And are there programs or organizations that work with manatees or sea turtles where undergraduate pre-vet students can gain veterinary experience?
Yeah, so our program does that. See, I can't remember if I have a slide on our program or not. I put a couple things on the end. Nope. But yeah, our let's see, I think you put it in the chat in the beginning, the link to our webpage. Let me see if I can put that up.
Perfect.
Hi, this is Connor. Hello.
Oh, hey, Connor.
Hi.
Hi. So University of Florida, do the vet students there actually get to like work hands-on with manatees that might be rehabilitated or rescued?
No.
No? Okay.
There are health assessments that are done where the vet students can attend and essentially watch and maybe help with some of the sampling and processing of the samples.
Oh,
but it's mostly our residents and interns that would actually be able to put hands on these animals. And part of that is really just regarding permitting and rules in regards to, what folks can and can't do. There are, externships where students can participate in things like that. And, our students will go to SeaWorld or to, Marine Mammal Center or other places where they're doing manatee care. And so the externships are really where they get more of the hands-on opportunities. Some of the classes will do tours, but most of the time it's visualizing and getting to watch things that are done there, you know, or we will have opportunities where you can do necropsies and you'll get to do things with carcasses, but
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the information.
sure. So I don't know, can you guys see the page with the website?
Yeah.
Okay, so so a lot of the information is under our education page. So we do have a certificate in aquatic animal medicine, which is specific for veterinary students, but it is only for UF veterinary students. We do have an online certificate that bundles a lot of our online courses. So aquatic wildlife health, manatee health, and diseases of warm water fish. So we cover a variety, everything from fish and invertebrates to marine mammals and sea turtles. We also have PhD and master's opportunities, as well as the residency and intern opportunities.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We have I put the URL for that website in the chat if anybody's interested in grabbing that. I'm going to do one last question. I think it's an important one about doing the health assessments on these animals in particular, where the animal is out of the water. Can you talk a little bit about how we maintain the health of the animals, while those assessments are going on?
Right. So we're under the clock as soon as we have the animal in the net and out of the water. Whatever we do within a 1 hour time period. And part of that is, we've had studies where we've looked at ACTH and cortisol to look at the stress levels of the animals. And so we know that within an hour, their cortisol levels have not gone up. I'm sure they do once we've put them back in the water and, their adrenaline is going, oh, I'm back. But the idea is that within that 1 hour, we're limiting the amount of time that they're stressed. If it's cold weather, we have blankets that, thermal blankets that we'll put on them. Because a lot of times we do the health assessments during the winter when we know they're in warm water sites that are predictable, and it's a little easier for us to net them. They're monitored throughout. We look at their glucose levels and their oxygen levels throughout the time period. But manatees, for the most part, are pretty stoic when they're out of the water. Unlike their relatives, the dugongs, which are much more high-strung and really stress out to the point where there have been some mortalities. So folks in Australia don't really do much in the way of health assessments because of that risk.
Do manatees ever? How do they do with gravity? When you pull them out of the water,
they do okay. They do okay because in the wild they often can strand themselves because they are curious animals. When there are storm surges, they'll end up in areas that they really don't belong. Occasionally, even just with high tides, they'll be stranded and have to wait for the tide to come back in. So they do okay. Most of the time they'll suffer through skin damage because they're really not meant to be dry docked. So when we transport them in the event that they need to be rehabilitated and moved from one facility to another, we have pads that they're put on and we make sure that their skin stays moist. And they do pretty well. It's just a matter of making sure that they don't damage themselves moving around or the people that are trying to keep an eye on them in the trucks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Larkin, for taking some time out of your day to talk with us for our lecture tonight. I learned a ton of stuff. I hope everybody else enjoyed as well.
Sure.
And I would love to invite everybody to join us again on January 7th. We'll have Dr. Gwen Goodman-Lowe from Cal State University, Long Beach, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about sort of the history of toxins in our local waters in Southern California and the impacts on marine life and marine mammals in particular. So I look forward to hopefully seeing you all again in the new year. Thank you
Sure.
so much, and happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And, feel free to share my email, if Connor wanted to reach out and ask me any further questions about doing aquatic veterinary medicine.
Yes.
Fantastic. We'll do that. We'll put that in the notes section when we post this to the web. All
Sure.
these lectures will get posted to the web. So thank you so much, and everyone have a great evening.
All right, you too. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great evening.
You too.